Welcome to the channel. We're going to discuss something kind of neat, kind of fun. I noticed recently going back through some letters from the archive related to Miss Barber. This here is a picture of the microfilm that you get from the Church Missionary Society archive. If you're looking into their archive for letters and stuff like that, they all come like this. And this is the picture of her letter from December 4th, 1905. You can find it in Jim Reetzke's biography as Seed Sown in China. You can find it on the website below. One thing I never noticed was look in the left corner there. There's this little note, literally like stitched onto the letter. What is that? It had never come up in anything that I had read, and I had never tried to read it before. This little note being stitched on clearly implies that when it was received in London, someone wanted this note to follow the letter around wherever it went, and it's with us still today. Well, first, a little backstory about this letter before we read the note and talk about what it says. This letter, again, was December 4th, 1905. These are just the last couple years where Miss Barber is an Anglican missionary with the Church Missionary Society, and this is just after the 1904 Welsh revival that would affect all of the Christian world, all of the missionary world. In that revival of 1904, about 70,000 people would become Christians between November and December of that year. A huge moving at that time, and that inspired everyone to pray, to search for the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, and to see their work, their evangelizing, take new dimension in the Spirit. In the winter of 1905, the American missions in Fuzhou, China, or in the whole province of Fujian, began to see this kind of blessing happening among them. There were 2 American missions in the city at that time, and they were noticing just an explosion or uncommon responses. They could look like an extended meetings for prayer, or their general number of conversions were just way, way higher than they typically saw and expected. Miss Barber writes this letter as like a report home. News of this happening among the American missions was being sent back to England from a lot of different avenues. Miss Barber writes back to Mr. Baring-Goulds to report what's going on in the same manner. What's interesting, in the first sentence of her letter, she says, "The revival has come to Fujian." If you look at it in the letter, you can see the, capital T, revival, capital R. So that tells us 2 things. What she's seeing happening in Fujian, in Fuzhou, the city, among her, she really sees it as something like a revival. She's using that term. And then by calling it capital T, capital R, the revival, she's linking it right with the Welsh revival of 1904. It's like she sees that outpouring of the Spirit in 1904 causing a flow that is moving right over to Fujian about a year later. She sees what she's experiencing right in line and a part of what happened in Wales. Now to go on, I'll read the first sentence for the letter. Just a line to tell you that the revival has come to Fukien. That's how they spelled Fujian back then. Though not as yet into our C.M.S. circle, period. She moves on to describe what's going on in the different American scenes, but that first sentence is really telling. There's a lot of the Lord is doing in Fujian, but not in the Anglican, in the British circles in the city. And all the rest of the descriptions that she gives for the rest of the letter are just among the American Methodist or the American Board mission. At the very end of the letter, she says, will you ask prayer for this, please, at your next weekly meeting, that these things would begin to happen more among the British congregations and schools that she is working in. Perhaps to support this request, Mr. Baring-Goulds sought to pass this letter on. It would make sense if you have they had little prayer meetings for the mission, and to inspire prayer, it would make sense to read a letter from a missionary giving some report of what things were going on the ground, or to showing them what they are asking prayer for. When he considered passing Miss Barber's letter around, she's so frank. She doesn't really cover things up that's nicely all the time. He felt he needed to write some little note, just a preface to incite some discretion in how this letter was passed on. If you look at, I'll read it now. It's kind of hard to read, but this is what I think it says. You can tell me what you think. This is how I transcribe it. In any use made of this letter, I trust that caution will be exercised. Real harm has too often resulted from failure in this respect. B.B.G, January 10, 06. Well, he's not saying don't read it. He could just keep it in his files and not pass it on. But whoever would bring this to a committee meeting or a prayer meeting, he's asking, be with caution. Make sure maybe the audience, I would assume, make sure the audience, they're all mature enough to handle her kind of tone, or they're sympathetic and united enough with the mission of the C.M.S. that the frustrations, that the limitations she mentioned aren't going to stumble them. But he's asking that real discretion be used. It's interesting because the Holy Spirit is clearly moving powerfully in that city where they've all invested so much time and labor. If you've read A Seed Sown in China or read some things about Emmy Barber's life, you know that in the mission at this time, 1905, there are some negative things going on behind the scenes. The Home Committee had recently really stirred up a hornet's nest by a proposal they were trying to get feedback on from the different missioners about kind of segregating the whole mission into probationary missionaries and staff missionaries. It's called the kind of controversy is called the status and probation of missionaries. But you can read more about that on your own. But that really sowed like it soured the well, poisoned the well. Maybe that's the phrase. Poisoned the well in the mission in a lot of ways. There's strife and frustration and enmity among a lot of people. So if you know that's going on in the background, and Miss Barber reports that the Lord is doing so much but not among us, that may frustrate you. You might feel that those two things are related. And that's where this kind of word, this note of caution from Mr. Baring-Gould makes a lot of sense. It's a little concerning. It's interesting. It's not a censure on Miss Barber in any way or what she wrote, but it shows that they really did need prayer, but they needed sympathetic prayer, discerning prayer, wise prayer. Well, what do you think? I think this note is super interesting. It tells us a lot about what was going on internally and behind the scenes, but it's kind of hard to read. What do you think? Did I read it right? Am I drawing the right conclusions or implications from both Miss Barber's letter and the notes? Let me know what you think in the comments below. This is just an example of the kind of fun stuff you can find digging through old archives.